Coming up, we've got breaking news off the top of the show as the NCAA has adopted major rule changes. It could have a big impact on the SEC. We'll tell you why next, right here on SEC Country Live. Hello everyone, I am Brandon Adams, and this is the former Alabama All-American Mike Johnson. We are live here on SEC Country Live. I promise we're here. Not a radio show. You'll be able to see us, and we'll have a good time talking to you today. Of course, we'll dive into the first and 10 the way that we always do. All the big news that we had planned on discussing on today's program, but every now and then we get a chance to bring you some relatively late breaking news here, certainly interesting news as it unfolds today. The NCAA adopting some rule changes for college football. Let me show you a couple tweets here from the official account of the NCAA, kind of explaining what's going down here as football is going to look a little differently. Here's the first one. The Division I Council adopts proposal that allows student athletes to transfer and receive a scholarship without asking their school for permission. The rule change goes into effect in October. So this is not a situation anymore where you had to ask somebody, is it okay if you transfer? Now I guess the new rule is notify. This is a situation where you say, hey, I'm now planning on leaving the school here. You don't have to get the waiver from the school when you do that. There's another rule we'll get to in a moment, but let's start with the transfer rule first. This is obviously a subject near and dear to your heart because you were a player. Right. What do you think about it?
No, I think it's the right thing to do. And it's a changing landscape. And honestly, I think that most people that have been looking at this rule and really looking into the ins and the outs of both these rule changes we're going to talk about, I think that we're just talking about a time that's passed us by in terms of college football. I think that things are changing, on the college football landscape in terms of transfers and player rules that some people might not be comfortable with. I'm going to include Nick Saban in that too because, as I've told you guys a million times, when it comes to some of these transfer rules, I'm in disagreement with Nick Saban and the way he feels on a lot of different things. And it's a sign of the times that athletes are being more and more in control of what their outcome and their destination is going to be in college football.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it's been moving that direction for a while. I know it's a hard thing for a lot of people to believe, but the truth is I am in favor of a very liberal transfer policy. Even I make no bones about the fact on this show that my favorite team is the Georgia Bulldogs. I obviously want UGA to win the games that it's played, but even if a Georgia player leaves and wants to transfer, I just think the right thing to do is allow that guy to go play where he wants to play. Now, it's unseemly to think of a former Georgia player playing at Florida, or a former Georgia player playing at Auburn, or somewhere like that. I don't like the thought of that, but I also feel like it's, from almost a moral standpoint, ugly to think that you would then restrict that guy and not allow him to do that. So a more liberal policy here, a chance to go and play where you can play, and that's really what players want. They want to be where they can be on the field. They don't want to be held hostage by the place where they sign their letter of intent. Well, I think a lot of us have seen the incongruity, maybe is the right word, between the player treatment and the coach treatment, where coaches have the freedom to sort of skip town anytime they want to. To me, this is a step towards equity here, which for me is the right way to go.
No, and I agree with you. And I've been on one of those teams where we lost a head coach. Now, I was very thankful and very excited to get Nick Saban as a head coach. I mean, it worked out being okay in my favor, but having a coach that recruited you, having a head coach like Mike Shula who ate at my dinner table in my house, not be my head coach, and me not being able to do anything about it or leave whenever I wanted to, I think you're right. I mean, this is a step in the right direction. I think this is something that was bound to happen. I think some people are still stuck with old rules and not wanting players to go other places, but this is a sign of the times.
Now, the other big rule change here, and this is probably the one that's going to impact the SEC the most, and frankly, it may go a long way towards sort of calming some fears about the transfer rule. The fact that now, and we'll show you the tweet here once again from the NCAA, who probably explains this as succinctly as it can be, starting this season, football players can play up to 4 games without losing a season of competition. In other words, you can now be considered a redshirt freshman next year, even if you play in up to 4 games this season. I think this is a very new landscape for college football, but it's one that I like, and I get the impression, based on what coaches have said in the past and even what some coaches have kind of already weighed in on today, I get the impression this is going to be a very popular rule change for both players and coaches alike.
Yeah, and I tend to think the same thing. I think this is a direct reaction to the bowl games. We've been seeing these players start to step out.
Yeah.
Some of the seniors or draft-eligible juniors. We saw Leonard Fournette do it. We saw Christian McCaffrey do it. Some of these players that are stepping out of these bowl games, I think this is a direct reaction to that, and I think it's great. I mean, I really do. I can't tell you how many careers that I saw, in terms of when I was in college that would have been changed by this rule. Allowing a guy to get 4 games in as a redshirt freshman, still get the redshirt season, still be able to carry over, still be able to do all the same things, but to get some of that game action, to be able to play in, possibly, a bowl game or something down the line and be able to get those live reps, I think is a huge deal for players.
Josh Kendall, who covers South Carolina for the State, that's the newspaper in Columbia, he gave us a quote not too long ago from Will Muschamp, who spoke about this back at the SEC spring meetings. Kendall quotes Muschamp as saying that all coaches are for that, the redshirt rule at the spring meetings. Let's see if I can find some more quotes from him. He says about his own career, he needed 2 years in terms of being a redshirt, but he says, I think that's changed because of the attrition at the top end of your roster for a lot of reasons. Guys transferring, guys graduating early, guys going to the NFL. You're seeing a lot more opportunity for young players to play, so you don't see as many guys being redshirted. I never make a decision on a red shirt until we get into the season. So he kind of goes on to talk about that, but this is a situation that Will Muschamp's going to really like this here, and I'll be honest with you. You can already look at storylines for how this may impact the SEC here in 2018. I'll give you Georgia as a for instance. A lot of people have wondered how it is that Jake Fromm and Justin Fields can coexist on the same roster at the same time. I think this 4-game redshirt rule makes it a little easier for that to happen. All of a sudden now Fields can play as much as he wants for 4 games. Fromm can still be the starter, and yet Fields can still be called a redshirt freshman next year. And at that point in time, Fromm's a junior. Maybe he's on his way to an early entrance in the NFL draft. You put a little bit of distance between Fromm and Fields. They're no longer just one class apart. Now, if Fields is the real deal, he's not sticking around Georgia for 4 years anyway. He may go to the NFL himself. But this, I think, makes it more likely that Georgia could hold on to Fromm.
No, I completely agree. And Bama fans that I've talked to, man, which has it been last year? You might have been a lot more reluctant to put Tua in some of those games.
Exactly, because I don't think it helps Alabama as much as it helps Georgia, because the person you'd want a redshirt here, if you're Alabama, is maybe Tua, but you don't really gain anything by redshirting, Jalen Hurts at this point.
No, yeah, you don't. And it is interesting, too, to look back. I mean, McBride from Tennessee last year, I mean, he plays a couple of games. We're talking about a laundry list of players this could have affected. It could have affected, Jordan Ta'amu, possibly, to get him on the field in certain instances. It's really interesting to look at. I mean, look at a guy like Miles Brennan down at LSU, could have been a redshirt candidate this past year. I think going forward, it's going to be interesting to see how it kind of changes.
All right, let me fly through some comments on this. Philip Matthews says, so the money teams can now lure away the superstars. Mixed emotions about this. He's talking about the new transfer rule, and I don't think that's the case. Remember, you still can't recruit a guy who's on somebody else's roster. You can't do anything until he announces his decision to transfer. So, I mean, if teams are going to follow the rules here, and you can have your own joke about that, but if they're going to follow the rules, the decision to transfer is made independent of where you might go. You look at your current situation and say, I don't want to be here anymore, and then it becomes open season for you. But this is not, to use your alma mater, Alabama cherry-picking the best player at a certain position that's a position of need for Alabama, because that would technically still violate the tampering rule here for a player who's got a letter of intent and a scholarship signed somewhere else.
Yeah, right, and this also works both ways, too, doesn't it? I mean, when you're at a place like Tennessee that wants to get a guy like Brandon Kennedy that might not be a grad transfer in the coming years, I mean, that's a two-way street. This thing is open to where players can just kind of move about and go to the places they think are more comfortable for them. It's definitely an interesting rule. I like it, like I said, because I'm a former player and because I've seen those circumstances where coaches can move freely for millions of dollars and players are stuck in one town.
On Facebook, Matt Markham says they should name this the Blake Barnett rule. I mean, I guess in some respects that may work out that way. Brandon Corbin says there's going to be a lot of under-the-table money transferring going on now. And, I don't think that stuff like this is going to be as much of the, quote, Wild West as some people say it is. I think that argument gets used by sort of old guard, people within the sport sometimes to sort of keep things the way they are. There's a certain establishment that always wants to support the status quo. Anything new is then viewed as being scary. I think this is obviously very different. I'm curious to see how it plays out. But just because it's new doesn't mean it has to be scary, and that's kind of the way I come down on it.
I completely agree with that. And I try to tell people when we talk about these rule changes and people that I've already talked to about it, don't get stuck in what the past was. I mean, there was a time, 50 years ago when freshmen couldn't play.
Right,
the freshmen couldn't play at all. And so let's try to keep up with the times. Let's understand that these rules are being made kind of in a reactionary method to where you say, hey, listen, this is 2018, and there's things we're more aware of now than we never were, and people are moving about more freely.
James Crump asks, how did the 4-game redshirt work? So I mean, obviously we'll all learn about this more in the days ahead, but my understanding is it's just 4 games. You can play the first 4, you can play the last 4, you can play the middle 4, you can play really anything you want, and I don't even think it has to be, your freshman season, assuming you haven't taken a red shirt in the past. I mean, my understanding is there's not a lot of restrictions on when these 4 games come, but the truth is this is all pretty new to a lot of us.
Yeah, and I think what's going to be interesting to kind of watch is, do you have possibly a guy that's coming back off injury? I mean, Zamir White would be a guy like this. Can you use that guy down the stretch? If you're Georgia and you get into the SEC championship game, I mean, can you use these guys down the stretch in really impactful games that otherwise you might have put back on the bench?
There's a better chance that Zamir White's Georgia's leading rusher than he redshirts.
I'm just saying, and this applies. This is not only Georgia. This applies.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I'm just messing with you.
Look at Auburn right now. Look at Auburn right now.
I understand what you're saying.
You got 6 different running backs at Auburn. Now, are you gonna redshirt the reigning Alabama Player of the Year over there? I don't think so. I don't know how you do, but if you have 6 guys. Hey, let's put one of these guys on the shelf for a little bit, and let's see if we need him at the end of the year.
Papa Doc 19 on YouTube says, is it limited to freshmen? It might help Alabama keep Jalen, depending on how close he is to graduating. Should he not be the starter, he can participate in 4 games this season and can still redshirt this year. I think this doesn't help Alabama as much as it might help some teams, because the truth is you want the Tua Tagovailoa era to begin. You don't want more eligibility for Jalen. I don't mean to make this sound harsh, but you don't want more eligibility for Hurts. You really want more eligibility for Tua. You're not going to be able to get that.
Well, I don't know. I don't know where I side on that. And it's going to be interesting, too, because there's always the chance that Nick Saban tries to sell Jalen on this idea. I mean, there's always a chance for that. Whatever keeps Jalen on the roster and gives you that Jalen as the backup quarterback, that'll be something Nick Saban tries to do. I don't know if it's possible. We've already heard from Averion Hurts that if Jalen's not QB1, he wants to go somewhere else.
Well, and the other thing here is the Jalen Hurts situation is really complicated because he has a multitude of options. For instance, he could take a redshirt year at Alabama, but then graduate and leave as a graduate transfer. Now, I guess the new transfer rule doesn't make the graduate transfer quite as, necessary as it used to be, maybe, but this is all really new. But for Jalen Hurts, he's got a lot of options. Sitting out, I guess, would be one of those because it would give him a chance to sort of get his degree and then move on, at that point in time.
It's going to be interesting to see. I mean, we're kind of learning with a lot of you guys, how this is going to impact and kind of diving into some of these storylines. It's going to be extremely interesting to kind of follow along with how these rules are I don't want to use the wrong words here, but how these rules are taken advantage of in different programs and different scenarios.
Yeah, I don't think that's a wrong way to say that at all. Papa Doc, by the way, also on YouTube says, you want Jalen as your backup quarterback. And I do agree with Doc on this one that, the real issue here for Alabama is having a national championship level backup quarterback. A lot of Bama fans would say Mac Jones may be that. A guy that like Jalen Hurts, who's played a lot, is a better example of that for me.
Well, I don't know that quarterback is the answer here. My thing is, if you're Jalen Hurts and you have even thought about switching positions, which I don't think he has, and I think he's a great quarterback. I think that, if he wants to play quarterback, he should. But if he's being sold on switching positions, let's give him a redshirt year. Say, hey, you can be the backup quarterback, and during the week, you can also work out with wide receivers or whatever position you want to switch to. And if we need you, guess what? We'll take that red shirt off you, and maybe you become the starting quarterback.
All right, let's jump into our SEC Country Live First and 10 list now with the stuff we planned on talking about today, including item number 1 on that list. It involves the Tennessee Vols, and Mike Griffith had a really interesting story, getting some quotes from the former Auburn head coach Terry Bowden weighing in on the turnaround attempt going on at Tennessee. And what Bowden says to Mike Griffith, I think is pretty provocative. And I think for Vols fans, this is another example of something that Mike and I have both talked about. Now, we don't revel in this idea, but we just think there could be potential turmoil coming. And the quote here from Terry Bowden is an example of how it might happen. Here is what he told SEC Country. If Tennessee gets the right coach, they can go all around the country and recruit whoever they want. I believe, now listen to this now. Terry Bowden says, I believe Pruitt is a part of it. But what gives them a chance is they hired Philip Fulmer as the athletic director. Fulmer knew what it took to win there. Now he's the athletic director. He knows what it's going to take to win and go national. Having him as the AD, I think he could have coached there a long time. But he knows what it takes to compete, what that coach will need to win at Tennessee. That's the ingredient that gives them the chance to get over the top. He knows all the people that have to help, and he can give Jeremy advice. That's, once again, Terry Bowden, the former Auburn coach, speaking to SEC Country. He says right there that in terms of the Tennessee turnaround, it's the athletic director, Philip Fulmer, who's more important than the coach, Jeremy Pruitt. I think if Pruitt were to hear this quote, I think it would drive him crazy. And I think that this thought that even if Tennessee does have success, they're going to be people who are going to want to lay the credit for that success at the feet of Philip Fulmer instead of Jeremy Pruitt. Folks, that is a firestorm brewing in Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm just trying to tell you.
And listen,
I am just trying to tell you.
Shannon Burgess weighs in the YouTube comment section. I completely agree with this. He says Terry is part of the old school.
That's true.
It's almost like he falls back in line with, boy, this is how I want to see the era of coaches I was a part of. You know what I mean? Like we really still doing a lot of things. I just think that, and Terry probably says, Jimbo Fisher's success at Florida State had to do with his dad. It blew. Honestly, I had to read the quote twice. To make sure I was reading it the right way out of what Terry Bowden was saying. I was like, surely he's not saying that Jeremy's just a part of it.
Right.
He was saying Jeremy's just one part of it. And it kind of blew my mind because we've wondered about this scenario. And obviously, Tennessee fans don't care a rip about what Terry Bowden's saying. But it does go along with the narrative that we've wondered about. Is Jeremy Pruitt really going to be in complete control? And if Philip Fulmer has that much to do with the team, it's wrong.
Well, I agree with what you mentioned, the commenter that said that. I agree with that because there's an element in which the old guard coaches don't like the new guard coaches because the new guard coaches just work harder than they do.
Right.
Jeremy Pruitt's one of these guys that sort of burns the candle at both ends, 100 hours a day, 100 miles an hour at all times. Back in the 90s, that's not what Terry Bowden and that crew were doing. Steve Spurrier's out playing golf. Terry Bowden was apparently eating. There was a lot of other kind of stuff, kind of going on there. That's what those coaches were just not going. Running the what is it called? In the red. They weren't running in the red quite as much as these new coaches are. And I think a lot of these old coaches resent that about these new coaches. They sort of changed the definition of what work ethic is for an SEC head coach.
Yeah, and you might be right. And I just. To me, it was truly I don't want to say shocking, I think that's going too far, but I was kind of jaw-dropped to read that statement because this has been my nightmare for Tennessee fans. And how many times have we gotten in here and said, you know what, Philip Fulmer knows a lot about the state of Tennessee. He knows a lot about UT. They are very lucky to have him. But let's not forget that Philip Fulmer was fired before Lane Kiffin was given that job. It cannot be Philip Fulmer having the most part to do with this head coaching hire. Philip Fulmer was not hired as the head coach of Tennessee football this year. Jeremy Pruitt was. Allow Jeremy Pruitt to run his system. He knows what winning football looks like.
Tony Elam in our Facebook comment section says, you mentioned the fact that Tennessee fans don't care what Terry Bowden says. Tony Elam says, yeah, Mike, we don't care what BA is saying either. So Tony's weighing in on that.
I don't care what I have to say either.
We appreciate you on that front. But here's the thing. What's troubling about what Terry Bowden says about the Tennessee situation here, more credit to Fulmer than Pruitt. I mean, in Fulmer's own words here, that notion of he's the boss and Pruitt's his employee, I mean, that kind of stuff comes out in some of the stuff that Pruitt, or I should say what Fulmer has said about Pruitt in the past. In fact, let's go back in time here to a couple of months ago. Here is Philip Fulmer talking about his relationship with Jeremy Pruitt, a description that I don't think that Pruitt, if he was honest, I don't think he's going to like this all too much. Here's Philip Fulmer.
That's a fine line. I'm not the coach. I don't want to be the coach. He's the coach. He's going to make the personnel decisions. He's going to make the third and short or the fourth and short call either side, or when to blitz or when to play prevent. All those things. But if I can keep him out of a ditch that I may have been in before, or Coach Dickey kept me out of, somewhere along the way, or just to have general conversation that with somebody that I don't have an agenda except that he has success.
Exactly.
That's my agenda. Everybody else around him, coordinators included, oftentimes can have, well, I want to lead the conference in passing so I can get a head coaching job. I want to do this. Everybody has an agenda. I don't. I'm interested in our program getting back to competing at a championship level.
I mean, you can hear that butt coming from 10 miles away when he says,
right.
Hey, I don't want to be the coach. I don't want to make the decisions on third and short. But if I can keep him out of a ditch, listen, I'm telling you right now, and I don't know Jeremy Pruitt personally, you do, but here's the assumption I'm going to make. Pruitt does not want Philip Fulmer helping him keep himself out of a ditch. I think that you don't get to be coach of Tennessee without the assumption internally that you're capable of keeping yourself out of a ditch. I mean, let's be honest about that.
And I think Morgan Recton brings up a good question on the YouTube page that I think points to the root of all this. If Tennessee isn't successful, who will Tennessee fans blame, Jeremy Pruitt or Philip Fulmer? And I think the answer is squarely Jeremy Pruitt. So if we're going to blame Jeremy Pruitt if he's not successful, then we've got to give him the praise when he is successful. And we cannot be on this, well, you know what, but he had Philip Fulmer in his corner. I don't think that's going to fly for Tennessee fans. I really don't. I think that if it's going to go both ways, let Jeremy Pruitt take the reins on this thing.
Saeed Ali over here on Facebook, though, says, I think that Pruitt's going to use this to his advantage if the Vols aren't winning games next year. Listen, I'm not trying to stir up trouble, but the person that's more in position to use this to his advantage is Philip Fulmer, because you're going to have these old guard guys saying he's the guy that's going to lead you back to success, and if it's terrible on the field for Philip Fulmer, he can point the finger of blame at Jeremy Pruitt.
Exactly.
It's sort of hard to blame the AD for losses on the field, but it's easy for the AD to blame the coach. And by the way, there are published reports that Philip Fulmer wanted to be that coach. I mean, he backdoored his way into being Tennessee AD. What would stop him from trying to backdoor his way back on the sideline?
I honestly don't know the answer, and I think it's going to be something we're going to have to follow. And it just goes along with my point when we started this conversation. I had to read it twice. I mean, I really did. I had to read the comment twice to make sure I was reading it right.
All right, let you hear one more from the past here when it comes to Philip Fulmer talking about Jeremy Pruitt. This is a guy who looks at himself as one capable of giving Pruitt a lot of advice. Just like Terry Bowden said, that's really what makes the Bowden comments, I think, relevant, is the fact they mirror and echo a lot of the things that Fulmer said himself. Here's another example.
And the only experience I had to draw from would have been my experience as a head coach, and I was really fortunate to have Doug Dickey there for me. You know, he had been a coach at Tennessee. You know, he knew the place, he knew the people. It was a good transition, an easy transition, and when I needed help, he was there, and I wasn't so prideful that I didn't ask for the help or advice. Now, we didn't always agree. Fact is, I think sometimes he came down and just threw stuff on the wall, you know, to see what would stick and where the conversation might go, and that was healthy too. And I think Jeremy and I have that same kind of relationship. I've been where he's trying to go, and I know what it looks like. He certainly knows what it looks like. Gosh, he's, you know, had success everywhere that he's been. Not just success, extreme success. I just think it's a very good situation for us to build on.
Grind Hard in the YouTube comment section says Philip Fulmer is going to pull a Barry Alvarez. That's the former Wisconsin coach who was the AD and found a way to get back on the football field and be a coach again, at least on an interim basis there at Wisconsin. Cliff Nelson on YouTube also says all Pruitt has to worry about is changing the culture and bringing in talent. The rest will take care of itself. And to me, this is more about the annoyance of some guy that wants to come sit in your office and sort of spitball ideas. I mean, you know, yes, you know, Pruitt's big directive here is bringing in talent and doing that kind of stuff. But when you got somebody who is, you know, constantly knocking on the door and saying, hey, you know, Jeremy, have you thought about doing this? How do you think this would work? That's the stuff that just becomes the kind of annoyance that if you're Jeremy Pruitt, you're trying to find a way to defend against that.
I think it comes down to being micromanaged. Don't micromanage Jeremy Pruitt. It kind of, you know, it blows your mind to think that a guy that's given his first opportunity to be a head coach and you just don't want him to be micromanaged. I think that's the nightmare for Tennessee fans. And Tennessee fans are upset in a lot of different ways in the comment section that we're talking about this. We have Tennessee fans back, in my opinion. I think it's just forewarning, saying this is the nightmare if Philip Fulmer kind of, you know, puts in on this too much. Let Jeremy Pruitt do his thing. I believe in Jeremy Pruitt as a head coach. Let him do his thing.
All right, let's do item number 2 here. We're up to a rip-roaring pace on SEC Country Live today. Item number 2 on our SEC Country Live first and 10 list. So we talked the other day about a pretty cool idea from the folks over at AL.com, who for years have been polling the SEC SIDs about, you know, various topics. We gave you their order of finish the other day, and we've also weighed in on some individual player superlatives. And the folks from AL.com, when asked to vote on SEC MVP for the upcoming season, or at least the SIDs, as tabulated by AL.com, give the nod here to Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm. Let me read to you what they say about Fromm here, Mike. They say, this is AL.com writing, the freshman breakout star took over when Jacob Eason went down in week 1, never looked back, led the Bulldogs to an SEC championship within a few plays of a national championship. Fromm completed 63% of his 230 passes for 2,173 yards, 21 touchdowns, just 5 picks. In the Rose Bowl win over Oklahoma, Fromm was 20 of 29 with 210 yards, a pair of touchdowns, good enough for a 69% completion percentage. Speaking of that Rose Bowl game, the week leading up to the game, obviously Jake Fromm was the focal point of many of the national media there asking about how Georgia had gotten to the college football playoff with a freshman quarterback. And here is how Kirby Smart described the maturation of Fromm over the course of his first year at Athens.
Jake continues to grow and mature. There was times that we were on the road and he led to help the team do 7-on-7s. He's grown as a leader among the team, and I think with each game and each situation he gets involved in, he tends to play better and understand the offense better. So they make the other players around him much better.
If you're curious, the runner-up for SEC MVP, according to the SEC SIDs, is quoted by AL.com. I feel like I'm doing an episode of Sesame Street with all those alphabets there. But is Drew Lock, the Missouri quarterback. Is Jake Fromm, in your opinion, a good pick to be most valuable player of the SEC?
I'm going to do something on the show I don't think I've ever done.
Wow.
And I'm going to stand up on this table and why is Jarrett Stidham not getting any love? I don't understand why this is not Jarrett Stidham. And listen, it was like top Heisman candidate on here. Drew Lock, Missouri, runner-up, Jarrett Stidham. Okay, that's like as close as he got to any of these.
Yeah.
Top passer, Tua Tagovailoa with Drew Lock as the runner-up. A top quarterback, Jake Fromm from Georgia, runner-up Drew Lock. Why is Jarrett Stidham not getting more praise? Jarrett Stidham is the guy that should be the MVP moving forward. Tell me why the argument is being made for Jake Fromm over Jarrett Stidham or Drew Lock over Jarrett Stidham. I'm a Bama guy, and as a Bama guy, even looking down at what's going on at Auburn, Jarrett Stidham is going to be the heart and soul of that offense this year. Both those quarterbacks, Jake Fromm and Jarrett Stidham, are losing a duo of running backs you can't replace. Jarrett Stidham, though, has proven that he's the better passer. He threw for like 800 more yards than Jake Fromm last year, had a better completion percentage, had more touchdowns. It blows my mind that, and I've been a guy that's done this in the past, that people continue to look over Jarrett Stidham in this part. I love what Jake Fromm is. I love the player he became last year. I love everything he did for that Georgia team. But let's not go out and act like he did the same things that Jarrett Stidham did at Auburn.
All right, a lot of good comments kind of coming in on this. Chris Morris agrees with you. He says he thinks Stidham's going to be the best quarterback in the SEC. But I kind of agree with Jeff Hensley here, who says, I'm not worried about the Jake Fromm pick. He's as good a pick as any other SEC player. For me, that's what it comes down to. I'm obviously a Georgia fan. I don't know that there's an emphatic argument in favor of Fromm over Jarrett Stidham, but I also don't see what's obviously wrong about picking Jake Fromm here.
Well, I think my point is that both these guys are in similar scenarios. And when you look at what Jarrett Stidham was to Auburn last year, I think he was more than what Jake Fromm was to Georgia. Georgia was, a run-first team to where, I think, honestly, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'm pretty sure Jarrett Stidham had 100 more passing attempts than Jake Fromm did last year. And I think the way that these offenses are constructed and what you can think is going to come from Gus Malzahn and Chip Lindsey's offense this year, I just think that Jarrett Stidham is going to be given the reins to what we both think is going to be the number 3 team in the SEC. And the way I'm looking at it, I just think Georgia's going to be way more of a run-first offense.
And by the way, Greg Steele in the Facebook comment section also mentions the few passing attempts for Fromm per game. But Fromm was also in a lot of blowout situations last year. You're not throwing the ball necessarily in the second half, and in some cases, Fromm was even in the game in the fourth quarter. But I feel like these numbers against Oklahoma in a game that Georgia had to have every offensive play it could get, 20 of 29, 210 yards and 2 touchdowns, in a game in which Chubb and Michelle were also doing their thing, that's a pretty good job there. I mean, that's more than just a game manager when you're making those kind of throws in a college football playoff Rose Bowl against the Heisman Trophy winner. When you win the head-to-head shootout against him, I mean, that's more than just a sort of run-first game manager quarterback.
I don't want it to sound like that I'm down on Jake Fromm.
I don't think you are.
I'm not.
I don't think you're being unfair.
I'm not down on Jake Fromm and Georgia at all. I think they're going to be an incredible football team. My question is, why is it that Jarrett Stidham doesn't get the nod in these instances? I'm not sitting here saying it should be Tua or that it should be Jalen Hurts. I don't like the Drew Lock pick either, but I don't understand why Jarrett Stidham, with all the stats he had last year, and I'll answer that question by coming back with this. The only other guy in the SEC that was sacked as many times as Jarrett Stidham last year was Felipe Franks. It was he just was not getting the help as much. And so having the play action and having more onus on him this year, I think that if he comes through in the clutch, he will be the MVP.
James Francis, a teach-out, I believe it says on Facebook, says Fromm was very good in the first half of the championship game, and he had the lucky throw in the third quarter. But for the most part, the Tide defense shut Fromm the Dogs down, just saying, roll Tide. I don't know how lucky the throw was in the third quarter. If anything, Fromm was sort of a bad luck interception there in that game. I mean, I think to be a freshman quarterback and get Georgia where Fromm got it, I mean, I do think that speaks for itself. And I like Stidham a lot. I'm going to take Stidham and Fromm over both over a guy like Drew Lock, who I think mostly is just a stat compiler. But from the perspective of a fan, I almost think that there's this misconception about Fromm, that he's nothing more than just a quarterback on a team that's going to run the ball. Yeah, game manager. Yeah. Look, let's fast forward to the end of the 2018 season. The run-pass balance for Georgia, I don't think it's going to be 65-35. I don't think it's going to be 2 runs for every pass. I think Georgia's actually going to throw the ball a lot more this season. I don't know if it's 50-50, but it's not going to be as imbalanced as it has been this season.
I agree with that. And I think Auburn's going to be a lot of the same way. It's not going to be the Kerryon Johnson show. It's not going to be. I don't think it's going to be the running game show. I think that Jarrett Stidham gets handed the reins to this offense, and he's allowed to do the things that Jarrett Stidham should do. Now, will the offensive line allow him time to do that? That's still a big question mark. I think that maybe you look at what Jake Fromm has around him and you award the MVP based on that. But I think Jarrett Stidham is going to be more Drew Lock this year than he is, Jake Fromm.
Trey Dukes wants to ask you this. Why don't y'all address Stidham on the road game? Is that a problem for you? Fromm certainly didn't. Now, his first road game against Notre Dame wasn't setting the world on fire, but it was his first ever start on the road at the hallowed Notre Dame Stadium. You have a problem with Stidham in his road game.
I do, but to me, it's the problem with Malzahn. It's not with Stidham. I mean, when you get sacked 11 times against Clemson, make an adjustment at some point in the game, right? Give this guy some kind of outlet. I just think that when you look at what Jared Stidham was to Auburn's football team, the things they did at home against Alabama and Georgia, the way they were able to shape up their season, I just feel like he's not getting due credit in some of these situations from these SIDs that we're voting.
So Bo Molinari, Facebook comment section, once again says Jake Fromm is Trent Dilfer. That's obviously a reference to Dilfer, who was the quarterback in the Baltimore Ravens when they won the Super Bowl back in 2000, and he was just a classic game manager. I'm speaking obviously as a fan here, but that's offensive. Jake Fromm, from a college standpoint, is a lot more than what Trent Dilfer was when he was the Baltimore Ravens quarterback. This is the kind of thing that, obviously I'm somewhat biased in favor of Fromm here, but this is the kind of thing I find myself wanting to defend Fromm on.
Right.
He is not that. He is not that quarterback, if that's what you think he is.
I don't think that he's that quarterback at all. I really don't. I've got to stop with saying that he's going to be the MVP of the SEC in 2018. I mean, he might be. I mean, he might run away with it. All of a sudden, it might turn into a fun and gun offense over there. But I just have a hard time looking past. I mean, and it's not even so much just Jared Stidham. I mean, think of what Jake Bentley could possibly do this year. Think of what Nick Fitzgerald could possibly do this year. Think of the other quarterbacks in the SEC. And for Jake Fromm to be handed the MVP preseason, it's hard for me.
We've got a lot of great comments coming in. That's one of the reasons why we're so slow today, is because we're reading a lot of comments because they're very good. Jonathan Jennings on YouTube says, who does Fromm throw to that's proven besides Riley Ridley this season? That's a real question. And Jonathan, I think it is a real question. And I don't think there's necessarily an obvious answer to that yet. It's one of the things that will determine part of Fromm's success. Here is Morgan Recton, who makes a pretty interesting argument, though. Morgan's a Florida fan, so he's got no dog in this fight, so to speak. But he says, what if Fromm was on Auburn last year and Stidham was on Georgia? How much changes? I mean, look, it's a great question. I like Stidham a lot. Do I think that Stidham could have had great success at Georgia? I think he really could have. Do I think that Fromm has as much success at Auburn? Look, the marriage between Fromm and Jim Chaney is working out really well. And having the Georgia offensive line, I mean, that does help Fromm. Obviously, it's a very different scenario. It's not an offense matched up for Fromm there, but I think Morgan's asking a really provocative question.
I think so too, because honestly, I'm not so sure that Jared Stidham. I think that I liked Stidham at Georgia better than I do Fromm at Georgia. Honestly, if I'm looking at it and you're saying you can have Jake Fromm at Georgia or Jared Stidham at Georgia, I think I'm taking Stidham. Like his arm talent to me, he's got more experience. I think that right now I like him better as a player.
It's a great question though, Morgan. Item number 3 on our SEC Country Live First and 10 list, and for those of you that think I don't give Florida enough credit in this topic, I'm going to do nothing but give Florida credit. Let me explain where this comes from. There was a reporter who covers the Nebraska Cornhuskers who had a chance to speak to a Nebraska assistant about how close that former UCF coach Scott Frost came to taking the Florida job before ultimately going to Nebraska. Let me show you the tweet here on the screen from Christopher Heedy. That's the reporter. Sean Beckton is the assistant coach. I don't know a lot about Beckton, but this is a pretty interesting quote. Beckton says that Florida asked Scott Frost to be head coach, but Florida would not allow him to bring all his staff. So Frost said no, #Huskers. I'm assuming this story is true. I'm assuming just based on the look here, that's a pretty serious reporter. I don't think he's tweeting this if it's not true.
I thought the same thing. With a headshot with the tie. I was like, wow, this guy's serious.
This guy's, he's Clark Kent or whatever. But I think this is actually, if this is true and it played out this way, this shows that Florida understands, to me, what it's going to take to get back to the top of the SEC. You're not going to be able to genius your way there. Scott Frost, some wizard of coaching who wants to bring his guys and they want to coach up the Florida roster. It's not going to work. You're going to have assistant coaches who understand how to recruit in the SEC. And that's why I believe, and I'm obviously reading a lot into this, but that's why I believe that Florida said no en masse. You can't just bring a whole bunch of FCS level coaches. You got to have some guys that know the SEC here. We don't want you that bad. We got to have guys that assistant coaches that understand how to recruit in the SEC. If this is true, I think it speaks to Florida understanding what it needs to get back to the top.
I agree, and to me, this is not even close to being something I think that Florida should have done. And I wonder if in the long run, Florida doesn't look back like Bama does at Rich Rodriguez. Boy, glad we kind of avoided that situation, because I really do feel like Dan Mullen is the better choice in the end, aside from Scott Frost. Scott Frost, listen, I think he's going to be good for Nebraska. I think he was a heck of a coach at UCF, but that's UCF, and it's not proving to anybody that you're going to win and successful in the long run. Dan Mullen's got a long track record of doing more with less. I think that Florida was completely in the right on this topic.
Perry Williams says Scott Frost is going to be a great coach. Too young to come to the SEC right now, but I think he'll work his way up the ladder. We'll see if that happens. William Dennis says Florida's still about 3 years or so away. William may be right about that too. I think when you look at a guy like Scott Frost, who, you talk about taking yourself seriously, takes himself incredibly seriously, the impression I get from him is he just thinks he's the smartest guy in the room. You are not going to outsmart other SEC coaches. That's not how you win in this league. You win in this league by building up an armada of talent. And if Scott Frost wanted to bring a bunch of guys from a glorified high school like UCF, to me that indicates that he just doesn't get it. And Nebraska is so desperate for anything that shows a pulse, anything that shows signs of life. I guess they'll just accept whatever. But that junk would not have worked in the SEC.
I agree, and this is Florida, to me, turning over a new leaf, saying, listen, it's time that we take control of what we're going to have in the coaching positions. We're not just going to bring in somebody that feels like – because to me, Jim McElwain – in a lot of different ways was a good coach, but I don't know if he had the handle on everything around the program. To me, Florida kind of turning over that leaf and saying, listen, we're going to get the right people in every position. That was the right way to go about it.
Rick Keene on the Facebook comment section agrees. He says, he's a Florida fan too, by the way, so glad Frost wasn't our guy. He wouldn't have stuck around for the long haul, and that's right. And listen, obviously I'm at odds with some Florida fans over Dan Mullen. I'm more skeptical of his success at Florida than a lot of the Gators fans are right now. But here's the one thing I will say about Dan Mullen. He is not going to embarrass you. He is not going to leave the program worse than he found it. Now, is he going to win the SEC there? We may disagree on that, Florida fans and me on that. However, he is going to have the program in better shape 3 or 4 years from now than it's in right now. In the case of Scott Frost, I know that UCF season is still fresh in everybody's mind. There's a chance that he falls flat on his face in a real big job like Florida, and after Jim McElwain swung and missed in recruiting, he could have really set the Florida program back. There is a low basement with Scott Frost that just does not exist with Dan Mullen.
No, I agree. And not only that, but it's been mentioned a couple of times in the comment section. I feel like this is the pinnacle for Dan Mullen. I don't know if you could have said Scott Frost sticks around for 10 years at Florida. I don't know if you could say anybody. I don't know if Jim McElwain would have stuck around for 10 years at Florida. But I think that Dan Mullen values this job, knows what can be done at Florida, and I think he sticks around for the long run for sure.
Item number 4 here in our SEC Country Live First and 10 list. Let's talk a little bit about the LSU Tigers. If you want to go back to the spring, Ed Orgeron addressed a pretty interesting position group for the Tigers. It's that wide receiver core. They've obviously recruited very well there. They bring in Jonathan Giles. He's a graduate transfer from Texas Tech. And in evaluating how that group is performing during the spring, here's what Ed Orgeron had to say.
Their releases, their footwork, Justin's very smooth. Stephon Sullivan's a big target, a big receiver. But also Terrace Marshall, he's looking good out there. The way he signed Jamar Chase and all our young receivers, Keenan Jones, Jeray Jenkins, we're going to give those guys all a chance to compete.
Terrace Marshall's obviously the big name there because he's the former 5-star recruit. Jamar Chase will arrive here this summer. I guess he's probably on campus right now. I also mentioned Giles, the Texas Tech transfer, who Orgeron doesn't really speak about there, but there's a lot of talent when you think about this wide receiver core. LSU fans are used to having teams that have big-time talent. But could this be the deepest crop of receivers that LSU's ever had? Well, recently Alex Hickey at SEC Country addressed that topic. He was asked about it as a part of his question of the day, and Alex gave a pretty interesting answer here. Let me read you what Hickey has to say from SEC Country. The current group, and you just heard Ed Orgeron talking about some of them, certainly could represent the most depth LSU has had at the position, even if it isn't the most talented. There's a reason Steve Ensminger wants up to 5 receivers on the field. It's what will give LSU the best chance to win this season. Just keep in mind, though, Alex Hickey writes, that only one of those receivers has a proven track record in college. It was in the Big 12. Texas Tech transfer Jonathan Giles is the only wide receiver in the team with more than 20 receptions. So that is Alex Hickey there from SEC Country saying, hey, this is a talented group, this is a deep group, but it is still young, and Jamar Chase and Terrace Marshall are probably going to be fan favorites there in Baton Rouge, but they haven't had college experience yet. What do you think about this crop of LSU receivers? Are you more interested in the fact that, whoa, they look like they could be good, or whoa, they haven't played yet?
I think it's the upside. I think it's the upside. I think it's, boy, they could be really incredibly good because, listen, we're gonna cover Arkansas's wide receiver core here in a little bit, and it's a completely different looking group. I mean, it is. It's all upside to me at LSU, and I know that Jonathan Giles, the upside's going to be huge for him. But even the guys like Stephen Sullivan, even a guy like Justin Jefferson, who really, hasn't played at all down at LSU. I mean, you saw some flashes from him in the spring game. All these guys kind of get their hands wet in the spring game, get their hand on some balls. They're rangy. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing when you talk about all these receivers are fast and rangy. They can make a quarterback, which LSU has had a ton of problems with, they can make a quarterback look better in any system. And when you get that kind of connection, when you get Steven Sullivan, when you get Derek Dillon, when you get a lot of these guys that are rangy, fast receivers, they're going to make any offense look better.
Cliff Nelson on YouTube says whoever the quarterback ends up being for LSU, Tyre's going to have to pass to set up the run this year. That may be true, although I guess Orgeron does like his offensive line a bit. And this goes back to a question I ask you in some form or fashion about once or twice a month. In the NFL, we sort of think of really good quarterbacks making average receivers better. Tom Brady's had a career of doing this, for instance. Joe Montana, when I was a kid, was kind of doing the same thing, Jerry Rice and John Taylor notwithstanding. You make average receivers better. But can really good receivers make an average quarterback better? Because, maybe Joe Burrow is really, really good, maybe he's not. But how much does the job help when you look over and see Terrace Marshall, who everybody wanted, and Jamar Chase, who literally everybody wanted, and at a point, everybody thought they were going to get?
Yeah, no, I think it works hand in hand. I think listen, when you talk about Tom Brady and you're talking about making receivers better, it's this guy, right? Julian Edelman. It's the little guys. When you have the rangy guys, when you have a Randy Moss body, by the way, I think Randy Moss's son plays for LSU this year. That's a random tidbit.
Are you serious? Are
I
we
think
old
he does.
enough?
Is that right, LSU fans?
Are we old enough for that?
Thaddeus
Wow.
Moss, I think he's a tight end down there. Anyways, beside the point. When you have rangy guys, though, it becomes easier to hit these guys in stride. It really does. When you're streaking across the middle, the reason Julio Jones is so good, hey, throw it on his hip, throw it out in front of him. He can go get it and still catch it on the run. I think that Joe Burrows or whoever, Miles Brennan, whatever, I think all these guys are going to be better off having the range this receiver corner has.
Yeah, Cliff Nelson says, and this is an interesting point, LSU has 3 wide receivers that are over 6'3" and run 4.4 or better. Problem is, can they use them effectively? And I guess here's the one thing, and listen, y'all, I'm not a former coach. Mike's the former player. He's the role of expert. I'm just a fan. But when I think about what Orgeron or what Alex Hickey wrote about the idea of having 5 receivers in the field at one time, that means no tight ends against a really good defensive line like Alabama, led by Raekwon Davis. The Texas A&M defensive line is going to be really good. Auburn's going to have a really good defensive line. Can you have extra receivers on the field at the expense of tight ends when you're facing these defensive fronts?
Yeah.
A&M, Auburn, Alabama, just those 3 alone. I'll add Mississippi State in that group as a really good defensive line as well. That's 4 of the best defensive lines in the country. They're in your dadgum division.
Yeah. You've got to make the plays. I mean, that's how the wheeze and woes of the football game. You have to have the rangy wide receivers that can go up and win the 50-50 balls. All of a sudden, Nick Saban looks at that and says, boy, we need to back a safety off. All of a sudden, we need to be in cover 2. All of a sudden, we need 2 safeties back deep. That takes somebody away from rushing the passer. That takes away the tight end from having to pick up a blitzer coming off the edge. It's a give and take. But if you have the guys that can win those 50-50 balls, look at Clemson. I mean, look at what Clemson's wide receivers were with Deshaun Watson. Winning the jump balls and winning the 50-50 balls is the reason they beat Alabama. And so when you have those guys, it's a weapon that not many people in the SEC can actually look at and say they've got receivers with that size and speed.
Item number 5 on our SEC Country Live First and 10 list, our buddy Andrew Astleford, who, by the way, just got married, had a really interesting series of articles where he's been talking to some of the tastemakers around the SEC about their various opinions for the upcoming college football season. One of the people he caught up with was Clay Travis, the radio host on Fox Sports Radio, and sort of Twitter provocateur, I guess, is the best description for Clay. And the subject comes up of how much longer Nick Saban's going to stick around Alabama. I don't know if Bama fans like Travis very much, but I think they may like what he has to say about Nick Saban and his coaching future. Here's what Clay Travis told Andrew Astleford in SEC Country. I think Saban fears not coaching. So I think he's now going to hold on for as long as he can in Alabama. And frankly, if you look at Tua and what they've got, the most amazing thing to me of Nick Saban's entire tenure is he's kind of flown in the face of everybody else in terms of dominating without a traditionally dominant quarterback. And then in that article from SEC Country, Clay goes on to talk about Tua Tagovailoa a bit more, and the insinuation here is that maybe Saban may be coaxed into sticking around because he's finally got a Tagovailoa, and I guess maybe also another Tagovailoa once Talia arrives on campus that gives him the kind of quarterback that he's not used to having. I agree with Clay Travis on that part of this conversation, that, having Tua now for at least 2 more years, maybe even 3, another Tagovailoa coming after that, I think the presence of this quarterback brother duo that are not only potentially good, but also, other than occasionally spouting off to middle school students, relatively easy to coach, that's the kind of thing that could keep Saban happy in Tuscaloosa, maybe?
I don't agree with Clay Travis's opinion that he fears not coaching, but I do hope he's right. I do hope that Nick Saban does fear not coaching, and I think when you have guys like Tua and some of the freshmen that they played last year, it does make it hard to step away from what you're coaching. I think they've built something that really has a lot of things left in front of them, and so I agree with what Clay Travis is saying. You really have done it to where he's built the powerhouse without having to do it. He's built something that is much more sustainable than having a generational quarterback. You know what I mean? Like he's built something that, listen, if we get these guys to block right and all these guys know exactly what they're supposed to do, and we can get a quarterback who just understands the very small details. Nick Saban goes into practice. He doesn't say, boy, you need to throw this 9 ball. You need to throw these dimes out here. You have to get the ball in front of your receiver. That's it. That's what you do on this play. And those details have allowed Nick Saban to be successful in a lot of different offenses.
Here's the one thing, though, that I can't help but come back to, and I'm surprised that nobody else ever says this. Now, you know this family personally, so you obviously can speak on this in a way that I can. But this notion that Nick Saban's going to decide when he's going to retire, I think is asinine. Miss Terry's going to tell him when to stop coaching. I'm not even being funny here. She's got plans for his life. This notion that Saban's going to keep coaching forever because he's afraid of not coaching. That's the thing that was attributed to Bobby Bowden and I guess Bear Bryant before that. That's the sort of legend that kind of comes with old coaches. Even if Saban did feel that way, Miss Terry is not going to let him sit around and sort of wallow in that feeling of I'm going to die if I stop coaching. She's got plans. I'm assuming they've got like grandkids and things like that. She's got things she's going to want to do. They're going to involve him not being the coach at Alabama anymore. So this idea that Saban's fully in charge of this decision, I just don't buy that.
Well, and I agree with you to an extent, but I think when you look at it, you have to understand that Miss Terry knows Nick, and I think she knows that Nick Saban would be miserable without something to do on a daily basis.
Yeah.
I mean, this guy's a workaholic, so I don't think Miss Terry is going to ask him to step away from the game and be like, you know what, you need to do nothing all day.
Right.
I think that she understands this is a guy who needs his hands on things, needs to be able to mold young men, and I think she likes that about him for the most part, and I agree with you to an extent that at some point down the road, she's going to make the decision and say, hey, listen, there's a health issue, there's something else going on, you need to step away. But I think that he's going to be involved in some capacity in coaching for a while.
Richard Smith says, I agree, BA. He's not just a coach. It's time to focus on family eventually. Listen, I think there's a lot of SEC fans who would certainly wish he'd focus on family a little bit more right now.
Yeah, no, and it's coming at some point. Listen, I told you before the start of the year that I thought it was 3 to 5 years. Mm-hmm. I really did. And then Chris Lowe has obviously come out and some other people this offseason said it's going to be at least 5 years. This guy is packing it up for the long haul, and we'll see.
All right, let's go to item number 6 here in our SEC Country Live First and 10 list. So Jimbo Fisher has been talking a lot about recruiting lately. I've been seeing a lot of tweets about this, and I kind of wanted to compile them together here to kind of give a little bit of an update on his thought process as he starts to build his roster there at Texas A&M. Let me show you one thing here in terms of what he's selling to recruits. This comes from TexAgs. That's a big site out there in College Station that covers Texas A&M. Here's a quote from Jimbo Fisher recently saying, I'm asking recruits to make the same decision that I made. I wasn't planning on coming to Texas A&M, but I got a call and started researching and was sold. We talk a lot to recruits about that, learning about what Texas A&M is and wanting to come here. And Jimbo Fisher, I guess, is also selling Texas A&M on the kind of players he wants. And there's a specific word that comes to mind here for him on that when he starts building his roster. Here's Brent Zwerneman, who also covers the Aggies, I think for the Houston Chronicle maybe. Brent tweets out that Jimbo Fisher on a key ingredient to success. He says it's grit. You can't define grit. There's not a definition for it. You got to dig your teeth into a job, and that's what our kids are learning to do. So he's trying to sell kids on what College Station is, but also trying to create College Station as a place that fosters grit, and I assume that means looking for recruits that sort of bring that in there. I mean, listen, this is what Texas A&M needs, especially the grit part, because I think we would all agree that Kevin Sumlin was a smart coach, but maybe not always the coach instilling the most toughness into his program there. Yeah. I mean, to me, this is an elixir for what has ailed Texas A&M.
No, I completely agree. He's saying all the right things, isn't he? I mean, he's filling in all the potholes along the road in terms of trying to get to a championship, because grit is one of the things that you look at. Texas A&M under Kevin Sumlin had guys along the way, but I don't know if you ever looked at their defense, which was the issue a lot of times, and said gritty. I think they've had obviously good defensive linemen, they've had good safeties, they've got good linebackers, but I don't know if you ever thought of them as gritty defense or stingy or any of those kind of adjectives or adverbs you want to kind of fill in the blank. So I think getting those kind of players in your program, which he has been recruiting those type of guys at a very high level, is going to be a number one for him.
On YouTube, Arkansas Motorcycle Ride says, "Where was that grit last year?" I think he's meaning it for Jimbo at Florida State, and there's no doubt about it. Jimbo sort of quit on recruiting there, and obviously had some real problems on the field. But I mean, can't you forgive a guy a sort of burned out status at the end of a long tenure, especially with the kind of pressure that Florida State fans put on a coach there? I mean, I think that A&M is getting a more re-energized, if that's even a word, version of Jimbo Fisher than the guy that was out of gas at the end of his Florida State time.
Yeah, I mean, I give him a small bit of a pass. I didn't think it would ever happen, but I think Jimbo Fisher actually made Nick Saban's into his tenure in Miami look pretty good. Like in terms of the way he left the Dolphins, it's like, I don't want to talk about that. I'm not going to Alabama. Jimbo Fisher does like the opposite. Like, I'm not going to talk about it, but everybody knows I'm probably going to Texas A&M and leaving Florida State. It's a tough pill to swallow as a former player because you do look at it and feel like maybe he quit on those players in a lot of different ways.
It's hard to
all the promises that he made them, and it's like, hey, I kind of quit halfway out the door. So
I'm high on Jimbo at Texas A&M, but what you said is hard to dispute there when it comes to that. All right, this time of year, for item number 7 here on our SEC Country Live First and 10 list, we like these videos that sort of show you behind the scenes of what goes on with the football program. As we said yesterday, Tennessee's been good at a lot of these. And here's an example of a training video using whatever you have at your disposal. I guess we saw not too long ago, they're still building the weight room there, so you have to go outside here to get a little work in. And take a look at these Vols players using one of the ramps at Neyland Stadium to get an uphill 80-yard sprint here. I mean, look, there's the gravelly voice horse strength coach, like every SEC program has to have. I mean, look at this. Come on. How hard must this be?
It's disgustingly hard. Listen, we had the spirals at Alabama. We didn't have like the long ramp. We had to run the spirals all the time. Absolute misery when you talk about running those spirals. Oh my God, it makes me.
I mean, for the most part, we think of these kinds of things as being a recruiting video. Nobody wants to come to Tennessee. They think about having to do that.
No, they do. I mean, that's just part of it. Listen, the decruitment has to start at some point. Maybe you shouldn't put it out there that early, but Craig Fitzgerald.
I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying don't broadcast that you're doing it.
Craig Fitzgerald, I think he's the highest paid strength coach in the SEC. He makes like $650,000.
Does he really?
And comes over from the Houston.
How'd your boy Scott Cochran let that happen?
Probably, yeah, he's not a fan of that. He's calling Jeremy Pruitt, going, "Hey, you didn't have an opening for your boy up there," so. But I mean, this is what you're going to get, man. And I'm telling you, I've run the spirals at Brighton. It's absolute, makes me sick thinking. I don't even want to talk about it.
Now, how much of the old school thing really is true? That being outside working in the heat like that makes you stronger, better, more equipped for the season than the air-conditioned weight room. Is that really true?
Oh, it's definitely true. It's definitely true because there's going to be times when you're in Knoxville and you play, first week in September, second week in September, and the conditions are going to be like that. It just teaches you not to worry about things you can't control. Control the things that are in front of you and make sure you're paying attention to what you can do.
I don't think I could do 80 yards at a 40, well, it would be about a 45-degree angle at full speed.
I'm not even kidding. It makes me sick to think. Makes me sick to think back on that. That's rough times, man.
All right, item number 8 here on our SEC Country Live First and 10 list. We've talked a lot about South Carolina quarterback commit Ryan Hilinski. First of all, in a year where it's not incredibly deep at the quarterback position when it comes to 2019 recruits, Hilinski's stature's really grown. But as it's grown, he's also got interest from other programs. At one point in time, there's been a little bad blood between Hilinski and South Carolina because they started offering other quarterbacks because maybe they got wind of the fact that Hilinski was either favoring a big-time program like Ohio State, which recently gave him an offer, and now he gets about as big an offer as a quarterback can get at the high school level. Ryan Hilinski says, humbled to say, I've received an offer from the University of Southern California, #FightOn. When you think about that program, the quarterback position, now back in the 70s and 80s it was running backs, but lately it's been quarterbacks. It's as good as it can get in terms of QB offers. Is Hilinski going to stick with South Carolina?
I think he is because I think this is a situation where you look at USC. Is it JT Daniels that signed on the dotted line? I mean, this is like a Todd Marinovich number 2. JT Daniels out there from everything I've read. Supposed to be the starting quarterback this fall, possibly as a true freshman. I don't think Hilinski goes that route. And for everything I've read about Ryan Hilinski, I think his family's like pulling a tongue of Iloa where his family's moving to Columbia, South Carolina. I mean, he's recruiting. He's in town this weekend in Columbia recruiting other players to try to come be a part of this class. I think that it's a little bit of a head scratcher that he continues to tweet things like this. Like why are you tweeting about the South Carolina?
But for the most part, everybody tweets their.
I do, and I think it's really a nod from him to say, hey, thank you for the offer to USC. I'm still probably really 100% to South Carolina. I keep saying USC, both these teams.
Yeah, they're both USC.
But I don't think South Carolina fans should be worried as well.
This is just a really weird year in that. In a typical year, with all due respect to Hilinski, he's probably not getting as much attention as he is, but there is no true 5-star quarterback this year. All of a sudden Ohio State and USC are having to look for quarterbacks in places where they're not used to looking for them because because there isn't that elite 5-star guy out there, and boy, it's hard not to notice that attention when the prettiest girls in the room start looking at you.
No, I know, and this this is a kid that traveling across country. All these questions are being asked, and I think that when you look at Ryan Holitsky, though, when you really look into the core of what his recruitment has been and what he's doing now, I think it's going to take something more than a USC offer with JT Daniels already on board over there to kind of pry him away from South Carolina.
Jamie Blanton says no one is worried about the SoCal offer, the USC offer for Ryan Olinsky. He's recruiting his you-know-what off for us. He's committed 100%, working hard, shows its fruits, the attention that you want to get. And Jamie, I'm not trying to troll here, but go ask Ohio State fans how hard Emory Jones was recruiting for Ohio State this time a year ago. Sometimes that's not always as much proof as you might think it is, although there's certainly plenty of reason to think that Holinsky would stick with what is a program on the rise there at South Carolina. All right, let's do item number 9 here on our SEC Country Live First and 10 list. I will admit I don't know a ton about this player, but it is an SEC team adding a transfer late in the process here. A Kansas wide receiver, Chase Harrell, has announced that he's on his way to Arkansas. He says, "I'm coming for everything this year." And he gives some thank yous out to Chad Morris and some of the others. Y'all getting a man on a mission, and he gives some of the customary hashtags there. And listen, he's got somewhat meager numbers. Kansas did catch 2 touchdowns a year ago. I guess my only point about this is if Chad Morris is going to be on brand and as advertised, this is the kind of thing you got to be in a lot of business for in the future. For every wide receiver who's sort of looking to be on a mission, come to a place like Arkansas, offensive-minded coach like Chad Morris, and pad your stats. That's what it's got to be about.
And that's what it is. And in my opinion, this is I'm probably going to make this a bigger deal for Arkansas than maybe even Arkansas fans are, because this is a big body guy, 6'4", 228 pounds. He's now the biggest wide receiver on Arkansas's roster. When you look at what Chad Morris' system are, they need a guy like this to pair with Jonathan Nance and LaMichael Petway and all the other. They don't have any proven wide receivers. It's kind of like LSU, where LSU has all these big body guys. Mm-hmm. Arkansas has unproven guys that are small, and so to be able to get some of these guys in the fold, like this guy, I don't even remember his name, Chase Harrell. To get a guy like that in the fold with that kind of size, I think is huge for Chad Morris. It upgrades, in my opinion, your roster at wide receiver immediately to get a guy that you need in the fold.
And I think, and I may stumble all over myself here, but I'm pretty sure that Doug Meacham left TCU to go be Kansas offensive coordinator. The Meacham offense, and I may have like 30% of this right, but the Meacham offense is going to be pretty similar to the Chad Morris offense. Yeah. So that's going to be a little bit of a sort of a turnkey fit there.
Well, right, and I think that
somebody Google that just to check and see if I'm right.
What he talks about when he's being recruited by Chad Morris is he wants to go to the NFL, and Chad Morris showed him film of guys he had at Clemson, Sammy Watkins, other guys that have been kind of under his wing. Showed him guys he's sent in the NFL and says, "This is what we're going to do with you as a big body guy."
All right, item number 10 here on our SEC Country Live First and 10 list. We occasionally play some audio from Ryan Fowler, who has been doing the Alabama SEC Country podcast. Ryan's got a really provocative radio show in Tuscaloosa. And recently, Ryan goes on our Tennessee podcast. And I thought this was really funny in terms of how Alabama, which is the school that Ryan covers, views Tennessee, which used to be one of the biggest rivals that anybody could have, the third Saturday in October. Well, here's what Ryan says is going to need to happen to get the Alabama-Tennessee rivalry, those fires stoked once again. This is kind of funny, although I guess Vols fans may not love it. Here is Ryan Fowler, SEC Country Zone. Take a listen.
I don't want to aggravate you guys too much, but we do a countdown here to Alabama football, but we also do a count where we have a couple of callers, and they'll ask me, how long has it been since Tennessee beat Alabama? And it's 4,253 days since the last time the Tennessee Volunteers have lined up and beat the Crimson Tide. Something tells me, I know as an Alabama guy, I don't want to see that go away, but I also understand for this rivalry to continue, Tennessee at some point is going to have to beat Alabama. It's going to have to happen if we're going to reestablish this thing and make what third Saturday of October really means to so many of us.
Chris Morris in the Facebook comment section, this is a really good point. I hadn't really thought about this. He says, this is critical to Auburn fans. We play Georgia every year. We need Tennessee to start playing Alabama tough. In other words, if we're going to have to sort of divide our attention between two big rivals, we need Alabama doing the same thing, which is a great point. And while, listen, some Tennessee fans may take umbrage with the tone in which Ryan Fowler delivers that message, it is sort of true here. The responsibility is borne by the underdog to make rivalries matter. And right now, Tennessee hasn't been doing enough in that regard. And Jeremy Pruitt himself has admitted that's one of his prime directives to make these rivalry games matter again.
No, and I think that Jeremy Pruitt's the guy to be able to do that. For as much as it hurts me as an Alabama guy to look at another Alabama guy as a coach at Tennessee and say he's the guy to get that done, he is. I mean, he knows the tenacity and physical nature it's going to take as a defensive team to be able to get that done against Alabama. Do I think it happens in 2018? I don't think he has the bodies to do that. But I think in the end, Jeremy Pruitt is the guy to get Tennessee to beat Alabama again. I mean, I was there in Neyland Stadium the last time it happened, the third weekend in October back in 2006 when Tennessee beat Alabama. It's not the same program right now. I mean, it's not even close to being the same program at Tennessee. So I think Jeremy Pruitt understands that. I think he knows what it takes. And honestly, in the long run, I think for me, it's Jeremy Pruitt, this guy that's going to get it done.
Well, that's a really interesting comment to make there. All right. Here on our program, we're always looking to close the show the same way every day. We're always looking for champions of life. And today, this is a pretty funny one, but it actually brings up a point that I've sort of debated among some of my friends for a long time. I want you to take a look at NFL kicker Graham Gano here. He's playing kickball with his family, and as you might imagine, NFL kicker with a kickball opportunity, well, he does exactly what you'd think. I mean, he just booms this thing. And then what I love here is then he trots around the bases, as a way of celebrating his home run there. I like the home run trot that Gano goes into. What this has always sort of brought to mind for me is, if you're playing kickball, if you're not going to divide up teams, who would you rather have? Like a really great athlete like a wide receiver, or like a really good kicker to play kickball?
You weren't here last week when we featured Julio Jones playing kickball.
And he missed the ball.
The ball. So it goes. And I actually grew up as childhood friends with Graham Gano.
Did you really?
From Pensacola, and
is that right?
Went to a high school there in Pensacola, and we were good buddies growing up. Went on a couple of visits together to Alabama. Actually,
where's his IROC Trans Am?
I don't know, man. I don't know anything about all that, but. Yeah, I mean, good guy. I would rather have Graham Gano on my team for sure. I mean, like he played soccer at his high school. I'm pretty sure he broke a couple ribs.
Did you grow up playing kickball?
No.
Oh, you did not?
Kickball, I think we were more of like a blooper ball kind of, like with a baseball.
You played kickball growing up, right? Yeah, you played kickball, right? Yeah.
Maybe every now and then. I'm telling you, it was more of like a soccer blooper ball kind of thing. But, teach their own. All
right, hey, we'll have the podcast up for you here on the various podcast channels. Check that out. Also, share the show with your friends on video. Let them know we're talking about the SEC here every afternoon on SEC Country Live. And we'll see you again tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for another episode of SEC Country Live. Y'all have a great day.